We all want interesting chord progressions, but most of us resort to using the most popular ones and then stop thinking about chords altogether. Often, these chord progressions can be highly tonal, which means that all the chords come from the same key. Plus, we tend to pick the chords that have the most notes in common, which means that any chord in the progression can be swapped for any other chord in the progression without really making much of a difference. So you can say that these chord progressions are lacking in tension. Let's think about the subject matter of a lot of music today: depression, anxiety, mental health, breakups, societal issues. These are all emotionally dark and complex subjects. So, do you really think that a simple chord progression that sounds smooth and has no tension is a good fit for subjects like this? Of course not. In the best case, it means that your chord progression doesn't really call much attention to itself. In a slightly worse case, it means that there might be some sort of cognitive dissonance between your music and the lyrics. But in the worst case, a boring or generic chord progression could signal to the listener that this might be a song that sounds similar to something that they've already heard before. Chances are they're just going to click away. You need to have just the right balance of novelty and familiarity to keep your listeners stimulated and intrigued, but comfortable enough so that they trust you to take them on a satisfying and worthwhile journey with your song. And a great way of striking that balance of familiarity and novelty with your chord progressions is to use something called modal borrowing. That might sound like a fancy smanchy theory term, but if you think of it as modal borrowing, then you'll see that it's actually pretty easy to understand and pretty easy to use too. So let's put ourselves in C major. So modal borrowing is when you borrow a chord from another mode or another key that has the same root. All this means is that if you're in C major, you can borrow chords that occur in C minor, for example. You can borrow from any of the modes or any weirdo scale that you like, but the most common one and the easiest one to get started with is the minor and the major. So here are the chords of C major that we played before, and then here are the chords of C minor. So this is the chord progression that we're going to use as an example. You've probably all heard it before. So now we're just going to start borrowing chords from C minor instead. Notice on how on that borrowed chord we feel a much stronger harmonic motion, and it feels like it wants to be resolved. When you're borrowing from minor, the notes that you are flattening will tend to want to resolve down. When you're in major and you're borrowing from minor, you're kind of borrowing the mood of sadness. So now we'll use the same chord progression but in minor. And now we'll borrow from major. In this case, you'll notice that the notes that we're changing, we are sharpening or raising, and they tend to want to be resolved up. For example, the B is raised and it wants to be resolved by continuing up to the C. So just keep this in mind when you're messing around with this stuff. Flat goes down and sharp goes up generally. Already with this basic 4 chord progression, you can tell that there are a lot of options at our disposal. So how do you know when to use these? That's the question. So first, if you're in the early stages of composing and your melody is not set in stone yet, then you can refer to your lyrics. Maybe at some point in the lyrics, there's a brief change in the tone or the mood, and you want to emphasize that with a chord. So then you can think of modal borrowing to better reflect the lyrics. Usually I'm happy, but today I'm sad. So second scenario is if you have a melody that you don't want to change, then that will dictate when and where you can do some modal borrowing. So it's basically only if you're singing the major third, major sixth, or major seventh that you wouldn't be
No,
able to borrow from minor because
no.
those notes don't exist in minor. So if that's the case, then you can borrow, then you can just try out the different chords from minor and see which one you prefer. But basically it's pretty intuitive. You'll just hear what you like and just choose those. So look, there are a ton of options and it might be intimidating, but once you start messing around with this, you'll start hearing when this technique is being used in other songs and you'll catch on pretty quick to what the commonly borrowed chords are and where they typically show up within the chord progression. If you've never done this before, I suggest having a list of the chords in major and in minor handy so that you can refer to it while making up your chord progressions. So pretty soon you'll have a larger toolkit at your disposal, which will help you give you more control over how your chord progressions support and reflect your lyrics, give you more ways of creating and resolving tension. More importantly, your chord progressions will be intriguing yet familiar enough to keep your listeners engaged and comfortable, and they will trust that you'll bring them on a satisfying and worthwhile journey with your song. Speaking of borrowed chords, this song that I broke down uses a lot of them. See if you can figure out which ones. Maybe you'll get some ideas.